All right. Welcome everyone to the Real Harriet Tubman. I am Afua Anoka, Marketing and Communications Director at the International Spy Museum here in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us today. I am beyond delighted that we have Dr. Kate Clifford Larson with us to discuss Harriet Tubman as we join in the nationwide celebration of the 200th anniversary of the year of her birth. Kate is a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestselling author of 3 critically acclaimed biographies, including Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero, and I've got my copy right here. She has also consulted on feature film scripts, including Focus Features' 2019 film about Tubman entitled Harriet. If you haven't had a chance to see the film, it's fantastic. It's currently available to watch for free on Peacock, so download that app. So now, before I turn this over to Kate, I wanted to share with you a quick visual of Harriet Tubman in the Spy Museum. On the museum's 4th floor, thank you, Hannah, we feature her in the Who Would Have Guessed exhibit. And that's the photo of her in the exhibit. Harriet was not only an American freedom fighter, we wanted more people to know about the incredible things she did during the Civil War as a Union spy and a military commander. I'm sure Kate will touch on that. So without further ado, over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Afua. This is really great to be here. So I'm going to talk about Tubman, and before she became a spy and a scout, she had to learn many, many skills, and I'm going to talk about how that happened. So I'm going to share my screen here. There we go. Thank you. Harriet Tubman was born on the eastern shore of Maryland in late February, early March, 1822. So we are celebrating her 200th birthday now. And this is just an old timey map of the Chesapeake, and there's Dorchester County and the neighboring county, Caroline County, where she spent time working as an enslaved person. And these are the landscapes that she rescued people and brought them away to freedom from. And I want to talk about these landscapes because they're really, really important. And I'm going to talk about the real Harriet Tubman. I will dispel some of the myths about her life that seem to pervade conversations about Tubman. But it's really important to recognize that. So we know that she could not read or write text. But that doesn't mean that she wasn't literate. She was literate. She had many important literacies that she learned on these landscapes that I'm showing you here, the Dorchester County, Caroline County, the eastern shore of Maryland. There's water everywhere, and she grew up on those landscapes. There were canals and bays and rivers and streams and the marshes. And so she grew up on those landscapes, the woods, the forests, the agricultural fields. And of course, there were spiritual landscapes too, where she became imbued with very different types of spiritual teachings, whether it was African spiritual and cultural traditions that were passed down to her from people in the community. Her grandmother, Modesty, was from present-day Ghana, and other Africans and descendants of Africans in the community. So she learned all of those, evangelical Protestant and Catholic traditions, all that were around her, and this is what she infused her life with. And it's important to spend time on the Eastern Shore. If any of you are there, go and see these landscapes. Many of them have not changed since the time that Tubman lived there. When she was born in March of 1822, her parents, Ben and Rit Ross, were living on the plantation of a man named Anthony Thompson, who was a well-to-do planter. He owned 1,000 acres in an area along the Blackwater River, south of present-day Madison, and in an area called Peter's Neck. And Ben and the enslaved community that she was born into, there were about 40 people. And so I show this record. It's a probate record that's held at the Maryland Historical Society. When Anthony Thompson died, the estate listed all of the enslaved people that were considered his property at the time. And Ben, Harriet Tubman's father, was the first name on this list. And next to it, it says his wife and children belonged to Edward Brodess. Edward Brodess was Thompson's stepson, and he actually enslaved Harriet Tubman's mother and all of Tubman's siblings, and including Tubman herself. When Tubman was born in 1822, she was the fifth of 9 children of Ben and Rit Ross. She had 4 brothers and 4 sisters, and she was named Araminta or Minty when she was born. Rit actually had female relatives that were also named Araminta or Minty, so it was sort of a family name. But these people, and I put them here because it's really important to say their names, to recognize their names, because these are the people that would come to play an important role in Tubman's life. They would be her teachers. They would help protect her. They would help her grow up to be strong and fierce. And they would keep the secrets when she became an Underground Railroad agent. They would not betray her. So they lived on that landscape that I just showed you those pictures of, and they're the ones that taught her how to survive on that landscape along with her parents, how to exploit those natural resources for survival. And she would take those lessons with her onto the Underground Railroad and into the Civil War when she battled the Confederacy and waged her war on slavery. So when she was about a small child, 4 or 5 years old, Edward Brodess brought Rit and all of her children to his own small farm near Bucktown, which was about 10 miles from the Thompson plantation. And he was a not very, well, I'm just going to say it. He was not a very smart guy. He was a lousy farmer, but he was rich in human property. Tubman and her mother and her siblings, as well as several other enslaved people. And he had a small farm. It was about 250 acres, but only about 120 was tillable. Some of it was marsh and scrub area, and it wasn't good for farming. So he leased out many of his enslaved people to other area farmers to earn some income. And he started leasing young Minty when she was 5 or 6 years old. And some of the people that he leased her out to were incredibly cruel to her. She said that Edward Brodess was not physically cruel to them, but the people that he hired them out to were. And she bore the scars on the back of her neck that she received starting at the age of 6. And when she died in 1913, at the age of 91, she still had those scars. So it was a traumatic childhood. She was forced to catch muskrats during the winter in those cold, icy marsh waters. She would get, and she didn't have protective clothing like they do today with the rubber boots and the heavy clothing, and she didn't have any of that. So she frequently was ill. She'd be sent back to her mother, who would nurse her back to health with the medicines that she could create herself, the folk remedies that she would make herself through resources right there on those landscapes. And Tubman would heal and then be hired out again. The other tragic thing that happened while they were with Brodess in Bucktown is that he sold 3 of Tubman's sisters, Lina, Soph, and Mariah Ritty, and that ripped the family apart. It was hard enough that they were taken away from Ben, 10 miles away in Peter's Neck, but also 3 of the sisters were sold away. And it was just, this is the horrible reality of the Eastern Shore of Maryland and the numbers of enslaved people that were sold to the Deep South. In fact, between 1800 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were transshipped from the Chesapeake to the Deep South to supply the demand for labor for those cotton fields and agricultural fields for timber, rice, etc. It was a horrific situation of tearing families apart, and Tubman's family suffered that fate as well. But Rit was a fierce, fierce mother, and she did what she could to protect her children. And so did the free and enslaved people around Tubman's family. In Dorchester County, by about 1840, half the population in the county, about 10,000 people, were African American, and half of those were free people. So many Black families were blended families of free and enslaved members. So in all these communities, it was the enslaved and free people that protected each other, helped each other to survive and navigate this incredibly hostile landscape. So after Tubman, so I'm just going to go back to this image here, the Bucktown store, which you can visit today. When Tubman was about 13 years old, she went to the Bucktown store to buy goods for the kitchen with the plantation kitchen where she had been hired, and she was with the plantation cook. And when they arrived at the store, there was an altercation happening. A young enslaved man had fled from his work assignment in the field. And the overseer, the manager of the plantation, was chasing him. And Tubman had wrapped her hair in a scarf that day. And in interviews later in her life, she said that that scarf saved her life, because the overseer, as she entered the store, was picking up an iron weight from the scales on the dry goods store counter. And he threw it, intending to hit the young enslaved man that was fleeing out of the building. He had called to Tubman to stop the young man. She did not. She stepped aside. And when the young man fled the store, she stepped back into the doorway, not realizing that the overseer was throwing this iron weight to hit the young man to stop him. And because she stood in the way, it slammed right into her head and cracked her skull open and knocked her unconscious. They brought her back to the plantation nearby where she had been hired, and she was unconscious. She laid on the seat of a loom. There was a loom in the kitchen, and there was a wooden bench that was a seat to the loom, and they left her there. And after a day and a half, the plantation owner came, shook her up, and sent her back out into the field. And she described this horrific injury and the blood and the sweat coming down her face until she collapsed in the fields, and they returned her to Edward Brodess, deeply wounded with a traumatic brain injury. Her mother took months to nurse her back to health. It's, in a way, it's a miracle with that kind of injury that she survived, but she did suffer from epileptic seizures for the rest of her life because of that head injury. She also became incredibly religious too during her teen years, and her seizures brought on hallucinations and visionary activity that she attributed to God, speaking to her, guiding her, taking care of her. And she felt great comfort sometimes by the voices and the visions that she would have when she would have a seizure. So she became very strong, and Edward Brodess hired her out to Madison in Dorchester County to the Stewart family. And they were a very wealthy family. They were merchants, they had shipyards, they owned ships, they had agricultural fields, and they owned many acres of forest land too. And so Tubman was sent there, and this was very close to where her father lived on the Anthony Thompson plantation. So she was back near the community that she had been born into. So she worked in the house of the Stewart. She didn't like doing the domestic work, and so eventually she was sent out to work in the fields. And then, because she was so strong, she was sent to work on the docks, loading and unloading ships. And she apparently was the marvel of the docks because she was so petite. She was 5 feet tall. She would, this little petite person was loading and unloading these ships. But what's really important for this is where some of her schooling, her education took place. There she met Black mariners. They were called blackjacks in the Chesapeake. And they were connected to a broader world, a world of information, a world of news, and they carried communication between communities and families that have been separated. They did bring news of where freedom could be had, where freedom was, where the safe places were, where the safe places were not. And so she learned who these mariners were, and those communication networks throughout the Chesapeake and the Atlantic world, going anywhere from, the Chesapeake to Philadelphia to New York to Boston and beyond. So this was a valuable lesson for her. I'm showing you here, this is just a graphic from the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park Visitor Center in Dorchester County. I encourage all of you to go and visit it. But it's a dock scene with sailors there talking to each other. They're passing along information. She became privy to that network. And I put this advertisement here. This is a runaway advertisement for Nellie Keene and her husband Joe, and their 8 children who escaped Easter 1832. And this is to show you the power of that maritime network. Joe and Nellie, their 8 children, she was pregnant with a 9th child, and Joe could sail a boat, and he stole the boat from their enslaver, Levin Wolford, put his family on the boat, and he sailed them to freedom. And you can see from this ad, Levin Wolford wasn't even sure how many children that Nellie had. But the good story is, in about 3 days, they were probably in Philadelphia. And several years later, I found them in Salem, Massachusetts. So they did achieve freedom and they got away. It's a remarkable story, but that's because of the strength of the maritime communities that Joe was aware of, and he was able to sail to safe harbors until he reached freedom in Philadelphia and beyond. Harriet Tubman also attained literacy in the night sky. She learned about the constellations. Because they lived in a maritime community, people there knew how to read the sky. The sailors needed to know the night sky to navigate. And in a community, it was just pervasive there. So her father, the community there, those sailors taught her how to find the North Star and find other constellations so she could use that. And it wasn't just useful when she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but even as an enslaved person, it was difficult to be able to find time or to get permission to visit family members that you're separated from. So people would go at night. And so she needed the night sky to be able to find her way. She also had to know about the different conditions traveling through the woods or across fields and not be seen. She couldn't carry a lantern. Lanterns, everyone has a lantern when they depict the Underground Railroad. If you want to be caught, carry a lantern through the woods or out in a field, someone is going to see you. So she needed to be able to navigate the woods and the fields without light. And she could do that. She also had to learn how to be very quiet. You know, in the wintertime, when there's no humidity and the air is crisp and dry, a snap of a twig, that noise can travel pretty far. And same with dried leaves and things like that. So she learned to be very, very quiet when navigating those landscapes. And it would come in very handy during the Underground Railroad and during the Civil War. She was able to live with her father starting in the late 1830s. He had a cabin. He was set free in 1840, according to a will that when Anthony Thompson died, he set Ben free and several other people free, and then set dates for the rest of his enslaved people to be set free as they reached a certain age. So here in Dorchester County, this is a dirt road that leads to his cabin site, which was discovered last spring by Julie Shablitsky and her team of archaeologists. And so they're continuing the dig there. But he was a very important man. He was a timber supervisor. He managed groups of men who would cut timber in the woods, haul it, and bring it to the water and ship it out to Baltimore, to Philadelphia, to New York and New England. So he was a very important man, and he stayed in that job once he achieved freedom. And here is the archaeological site, and they are coming up with items that were in the household. You know, there was china, there's window glass, pipe stems, coins. So we're getting a fuller vision of what Tubman and her family lived with around 1840. So stay tuned for more reporting on the archaeological dig. But she was able to live with her father, and her education continued because he was such an important man, and he had great knowledge of that landscape and beyond, and he had networks too. She was able to negotiate a deal with her enslaver, Edward Brodus, where she paid him $60 a year, and then she could hire herself out to whomever she wanted to and earn wages. She earned enough money to buy 2 head of oxen, which maximized her earning power. She was an entrepreneur like her father. So here's another educational opportunity for her. Her school on that landscape in that community really did an amazing job with this young woman who had so few resources, but she gained incredible knowledge living there and working there. And so, you know, she understood about, she was very proud of her ability to chop wood and haul trees and logs, and navigate the canal system there with her oxen and plow those fields and get across those fields and make connections throughout the Eastern Shore with many people. And if you think of the 19th century, the water was the superhighway. The roads were dirt. They were horrible. The last thing you really wanted to do was travel long distance on a dirt road in a wagon or whatever. So the water was the swiftest way to travel. So she made many, many connections, getting to know all those mariners, the boat captains, and the dock workers who kept a lot of secrets and passed along a lot of information. She married John Tubman, a free man, in 1844. He was free-born of free parents. He had a long family tree of free people, and they lived in that nearby Peter's Neck. So she worked with him and married him. But in 1849, Edward Brodess died, and he left his widow deeply in debt. Like I said, he was not a very smart guy, and he was not a good farmer or a businessman. So she, in order to save her farm and provide for she had 8 children, 6 of them still were minor children at home. She turned to her enslaved property as a way to pay her bills. And she decided to sell Minty and her brothers Henry and Ben. And Tubman heard this was going to happen, and she was working in Caroline County at the time with her father, and working in the fields and cutting timber with him on a huge 2,000-acre plantation in Caroline County. So she and her brothers decided to escape on September 17th, 1849. And according to her testimony, they only got so far, and they stayed away a couple of weeks, but they got confused about which way to go and who to trust. And her brothers were very, very nervous, so they dragged her back. And Tubman was disappointed because she knew she was going to be sold. And she said that she decided that she would have liberty or death, because she knew that if she sold away from her family, it was really a death sentence. So she decided she would try to take her freedom. And so she did. Sometime in the late fall of 1849, she fled on her own. This is a reward advertisement that Eliza Brodess posted to capture Minty and her 2 brothers, Ben and Henry, when they first escaped. This was discovered in a dumpster in Dorchester County in 2001. It was bound volumes of the local newspaper. We did not know exactly the date that she escaped until a local man dove into the dumpster to get out whatever he could find. Dumpster diving is a thing. It's a great thing. And he rescued a lot of these materials, and this was one of the runaway ads. So I know there's a myth out there that the reward for her capture was $40,000. That was made up after the Civil War. That never happened. The only reward for the capture of Harriet Tubman or Minty Ross was $100, and $100 for her brother Henry and $100 for her brother Ben. So Tubman had been approached by a Quaker woman that lived nearby in Caroline County, and the woman had said to her, "If you need help, let me know, Minty." So Tubman took a chance and approached her, and so the woman said, "When you come, I will help you." Minty went there. The woman said, "Sweep the front yard so it looks like you're working for me. When my husband comes tonight, he will take you to the next stop on the Underground Railroad." Her husband hid her in a wagon and took her to the next station until eventually she reached Pennsylvania. I have a clip here from the Harriet movie when the scene where she reaches freedom, and Tubman said this, and I'm going to quote her. She said, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But," she said, "and so it was with me. I had crossed the line. I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land, and my home, after all, was down in Maryland, because my father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were there. But I was free, and they should be free. I would make a home in the North and bring them there, God helping me. And oh, how I prayed then. I said to the Lord, I'm going to hold steady onto you, and I know you'll see me through. And he did. She embarked on a 10-year campaign to rescue her family and friends from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. She made about 13 trips and rescued about 70 people, and she gave instructions to about 70 more who found their way to freedom independently. These images, the top one and the bottom one, are from the Harriet film, and the one in the middle is a photograph I took when we were filming the orientation film for the Harriet Tubman Visitor Center in Dorchester County. It is remarkable that she was so successful in rescuing people and never got caught. Tubman actually said several times during lectures in the North that she made 8 or 9 trips and rescued about 40 to 50 people, but we've been able to document 13 trips and 60 to 70 people. The myth of the 300 people in 19 trips was made up by her early biographer, Sarah Bradford, in 1868 after the Civil War. So how did Tubman do that? How was she so successful to rescue all these people? Well, I can tell you there are myths. She did not use a quill code. That's a myth. She did not use the lawn jockeys that were signals. No, that's a myth. She didn't sing Follow the Drinking Gourd. That's a myth. That song was first recorded in 1928 or documented in 1928 and recorded first by Lee Hayes and the Weavers, a white folk group, in 1947. She had nothing to do with any of those myths. What she did use was the North Star and all those communication networks, all those networks of people that she had learned, the lessons that she learned from all those people in the community on those docks are what helped her become an incredible Underground Railroad agent and conductor who never got caught. And I'm just using this as a representative of her networks that once she got north, she tapped into a powerful network of Black and white abolitionists who were willing to help her. And she had this powerful personality that drew people to her, and they earned her respect. And they, of course, respected her, but they were in awe of her courage and her great genius and brilliance. So when we were developing the exhibits for the Tubman Center in Dorchester County, we have an interactive where you can press on different areas or different like buttons here, and you can learn about the people in her network. But the software could only do 48 people. We had many more, but we had to keep it to 48 people. And I just want you to pause for a minute and think about that. Here is this woman who had no formal schooling, formerly enslaved with no resources, ends up in Philadelphia and creates this incredible supportive network. She had no car, she had no telephone, no smartphone, no Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, none of that. She was able to do this personally. She was such a powerful, brilliant woman. And she inspired all of those people. They would listen to her, and she would demand that they do more, that they be better, they work harder. And they felt compelled to do so because here was this petite little woman who was risking her life every day. And she's telling them, and do more, help me. And they did. Some of the networks involved the African-American free and enslaved women in the markets on the waterfront, the vendors, and they it's been documented that some of these women carried forged passes. So if you're an African-American and you want to leave the state of Maryland, you have to have a pass to leave. So these women would have forged passes, and they would give them out to freedom seekers who would make their way to Philadelphia. Then they would turn those passes in. The passes would be returned to the market women in, say, Baltimore, on the waterfront in Baltimore. Tubman tapped into that. Tubman had relatives and friends living and working on the waterfront in Baltimore and other port communities throughout the Chesapeake. She relied on their help to get messages, to shelter her and her freedom seekers that she was rescuing. And the connections through these maritime connections, as I said, spread to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston and beyond. And this lower right-hand corner picture is of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Those are barrels of whale oil that are on the docks there. There were many Eastern Shore, formerly enslaved people and freedom seekers who lived there, and they were part of this incredible network of support for Tubman on the Underground Railroad. And it was a vibrant, free and freedom-seeking fugitive community there, and they were they held that community together, and they prevented slave catchers from taking people from that community. So it's an incredible network over many, 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 many hundreds of miles. She also relied on Black and white agents in the area. William Still, the upper left-hand corner, was an Underground Railroad agent in Philadelphia. He helped over 1,000 people through the city of Philadelphia. Thomas Garrett, a Quaker in Wilmington, Delaware, he's credited with helping 2,700 people flee the Eastern Shore and beyond. The house picture down here are the Quakers, the Levertons. They may have helped Tubman when she first escaped. We're not really sure, but they're one of two families that lived nearby that were Quakers when she escaped. And then the lower right-hand corner is Reverend Samuel Green. And for any of you who have seen the Harriet movie, he is featured in it as an Underground Railroad agent. He was a free Black man minister in East Newmarket, and he helped many, many people escape, including Tubman and some of her freedom-seeking friends and family. He was eventually suspected of helping people escape. He was put on trial as an Underground Railroad agent. The all-white jury found him innocent. He was so highly regarded that people didn't believe there was enough evidence, but the slaveholders were really angry, so they brought him up on charges of owning a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was illegal for African Americans to own in Maryland. And he was found guilty, convicted, and sent to prison for 10 years. So Tubman, throughout the 1850s, she spent all this time rescuing family members and friends. Regrettably, on her last rescue mission, she tried to rescue her sister Rachel and Rachel's two children. What she did not know was that Rachel had died in the intervening time, and Tubman needed $30 to bribe somebody to bring Rachel's two children to her, and she didn't have the money, so she had to leave them behind. She rescued another family called the Ennals family and brought them to freedom, and that was in late 1860 into January 1861. It was one of the great regrets of her life that she wasn't able to rescue her sister Rachel. But as the Civil War started, she decided to take her battle against slavery to the real battlefield. John Andrew of Massachusetts admired Tubman greatly. He had met her when she spent time in Boston during the 1850s, and he made arrangements to send her to Hilton Head district in Port Royal and Beaufort in South Carolina. He knew that her skills as a spy and a scout would be very valuable to the United States Army that had captured that area of South Carolina. So he sent her down there. And here is a woodcut. This is based on a photograph that we have not been able to locate yet, but here she is in her Union uniform, her blue greatcoat, her the satchel, and her rifle. And the folks at Gettysburg, who are specialists in Civil War weapons, they said, according to this drawing, that is a specially made, privately made sharpshooter's rifle that she had there. So, you know, she was accorded the weaponry and the uniform of a soldier, and in fact, she was. She went on to lead a troop of 8 male scouts, Black scouts, who infiltrated the landscape near the Hilton Head area to get intelligence from local enslaved people and to find out what rebel forces were doing. She was incredibly successful. In June of 1863, she helped lead Colonel James Montgomery and his 2nd South Carolina Colored Volunteers up the Combahee River. They routed out rebel forces, they burned plantations, they destroyed bridges, and they rescued 750 enslaved people. When they returned to Port Royal and Beaufort the next day, in early June, The newspaper reporters attended a rally where they brought all of the people that they had rescued. And the articles in the national news reported that the Black She-Moses had led the raid. So she's really the first woman to actually lead an armed military raid in United States history. Her spy work was so important that Union generals and officers accorded her great respect and admired her so much and relied on her great work. And this is a portion of a letter that was discovered maybe 4 years ago in the collection of Governor John Andrews' papers in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And here, an aide to the governor was down in Hilton Head, and he observed General David Hunter, who was the commander of the Department of the South, that whole district down there. And he observed the general fetch a pitcher of water and stand waiting with it, and I'm quoting here, waiting with it in his hands while a Black woman drank as if he had been one of his own servants. That woman was Harriet Tubman. So I want you to think about that. Here is an African-American woman, 5 foot tall, without a formal education, but an incredible, great leader. And this general is standing at attention, serving her out of his great respect for her. That's what she did. She inspired people so much with her great intelligence and her great work throughout the Civil War. She also witnessed the Battle of Fort Wagner. She said that she witnessed the battle and buried the dead. And I'd like to share this quote with you. She later told a historian the details about the battle that she witnessed. She served Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the commander of the Massachusetts 54th Black Regiment that was so valiant and fought so hard during the Battle of Fort Wagner. And this is what she said. And then we saw the lightning, and that was the guns. And then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns. And then we heard the rain falling, and that was the drops of blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was the dead that we reaped. She was an incredible, incredible force during the Civil War, and she did whatever she needed to do to help the United States Army and Navy win the battles and destroy and end slavery. In June of 2021, the United States Army Military Intelligence Corps Hall of Fame inducted her into their Hall of Fame as a full member. They had originally brought her in as an honorary member, and we all were irritated because we thought she should be a full member. And they said, okay, prove it to us. Show us the documentation that she was a spy and a scout. So we pulled the documentation together, and they agreed. And now she is on that wall at Fort Huachuca in Arizona right now. And this is a picture from the induction ceremony. And there is Tina Wyatt, who is a Tubman relative, who received the honor for the family. Tubman settled in Auburn, New York, and she brought her family there they had settled temporarily in Canada. She brought them to Auburn, New York, where she had a 7-acre farm she purchased from William Henry Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. She married a second time because her first husband married somebody else after Tubman fled, and then he was murdered by a white man in Dorchester County after the Civil War. So she married Nelson Davis, who was 22 years younger than she was. He was a Civil War veteran. He is sitting there in a chair next to her in that photograph, and they adopted a baby girl named Gertie, who is standing between the two of them at the end. The others are neighbors, boarders in her house, and relatives. You can visit her house today. The brick residence is also part of a larger park. She bought the 25 acres abutting her 7-acre farm in 1896 so she could open a home for the aged and also a nursing home. So it's a rest home, sort of like assisted living and a nursing home, because facilities for African Americans were segregated at the time, and she wanted services for African Americans and also for people who were indigent and couldn't afford other facilities. She died on March 10th, 1913, at the age of 91, and she was perhaps more famous the day that she died than she was during and after the Civil War. And in fact, the New York Times that year, at the end of the year, they listed 250 most famous people in the world to have died in 1913, and Harriet Tubman was one of them. In 1944, a United States Liberty ship was launched in honor of Harriet Tubman, and it saw service until 1970 when it was finally scrapped. And now you can visit her home and her church in Auburn, New York, which are a part of a national park in Auburn. And you can visit the state park in Maryland, and there's a national park there too. And the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway, which is 125 miles through Dorchester and Caroline counties in Maryland, another 90 miles through Delaware, and it heads another 25 miles into Philadelphia. And we're trying to have it go from Philadelphia through New York City all the way up to Albany and across central New York to Canada, so that we have the full breadth of Tubman's work as an enslaved person, her rescue missions, her Underground Railroad work, and then her life in freedom in New York for the last 50 years of her life. So Harriet Tubman still inspires people today, and the truth of her story is so much better than the myths. The reality, her brilliance, her genius, all the work that she did, and her great intelligence work. As a matter of fact, the general that inducted her into the Hall of Fame said that she was really a special ops officer. And to hear him say those words was just thrilling to hear. And so let's get her on the $20 bill, everybody. So thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. You've learned more about Tubman. I hope you were able to dispel and forget those myths and view her as a real human being, raised, educated, celebrated in the community in Maryland and beyond. So thank you.
Just marvelous, Kate. Thank you so much. That's just fantastic storytelling. Before we turn it over to everyone else and the questions, I did have one question in mind. Being someone who is petite in size, I'm curious how a 5-foot-something, year old woman was able to get behind enemy lines as a spy. Did she afford any disguises? What were her tradecraft skills as a spy?
So I think her tradecraft skills come from being raised on that landscape in Maryland, which is very similar to the landscapes there in South Carolina, the marshes, all that water, the woods. So she had learned from childhood how to navigate that landscape as a small child, and then as an adult. So she just put those skills to use there in South Carolina. Of course, she blended in with the enslaved community. They're just not going to notice another African-American woman, that's for sure. So she used that to her advantage. Now, on the Underground Railroad days, she did disguise herself. Sometimes she disguised herself as a man, sometimes as a middle-class woman who could read, even though she couldn't read. So she did have other disguises, but down there it was just being able to navigate a landscape without being seen, and she knew how to do that.
Just brilliant. All right, I'm going to throw it over to Amanda. Amanda, what does the audience want to know?
Well, first of all, the audience says, wow, this was a terrific presentation, which we certainly agreed with. And we got a wide range of questions. I'm going to go chronologically because I want to hit them all. They're so good. First of all, Kate, what did Harriet eat as an enslaved child?
So she would have try to survive on whatever cornmeal might have been provided, or that her mother or other people in the community could create or get. There was muskrat, there was fish, there were rabbits and squirrels, deer, ducks and turkeys, and things that other people in the community might have been able to get in the wild. And then, of course, there were farm animals that were there. If she was lucky, she'd be able to get a cup of milk from a cow or a goat. If there was a hog slaughter, were some of the enslaved people able to take parts of what was left over, the intestines, the hooves, the things, the tongues and things like that. So her diet, no doubt, was spotty, but there were resources on that landscape that they could forage for berries and fruit at different times of the year. And of course, the oysters and crabs and fish and things like that.
So how old was she when she worked on the docks?
So she was a teenager when she started working on the docks. She was born in 1822. She started working on those docks, when she was like 14, 15 years old. And she just was that sense of determination and that confidence. I have to give her parents and the community around her, her family, for building that confidence in her that she could do that work, and to give her the skills and the resources to protect herself, and to do the best that she could and survive, because it was always precarious as an enslaved woman in particular to survive that life.
One guest wanted to know, logistically, how can a family be partially enslaved and partially free?
So portions of, like, Ben Ross was given his freedom, but his wife and children were still enslaved. So there were situations where that would happen, or an enslaved woman would be set free. Some of her children could be born free after that, but if she gave birth to children before she was set free, they would remain enslaved. She could marry a free man or an enslaved man. So it was just those kinds of blended families that by the actually after the turn of into the 19th century, that was becoming more common. But as I said, by 1840, half the population, Black population, was free in the county. So it was very much, and so the promise and the hope for freedom was always there. But the free population didn't leave because their loved ones were there. It's hard to make that decision to leave the people that you love.
Yes, that is, we can't even imagine. I think it's so hard for us to try to imagine what this world was like. But a film that you consulted on did try to imagine Harriet's life. Afua mentioned that earlier. And one guest wants to know, in particular, there is a scene where Harriet crosses the river on foot. Is that real or imagined by the scriptwriter? And that guest says, thank you, from Paris.
Well, thank you for the question. Actually, that is based on Tubman's testimony. She said that she was leading freedom seekers and they were in danger, and she knew that she could not continue in the direction she was going, and so they needed to cross this stream or river, and the freedom seekers with her were afraid, and she said, we're going. And so she went across the water and made it to the other side without drowning, because of course it was dangerous to go in the water if you didn't know how deep it was, because so few people could swim in those days. So that's a real scene, and she testified to that actually happening.
When did she change her name from Minty to Harriet?
She said in her application for a Civil War pension that she changed her name to Harriet when she got married to John Tubman. So she went from Minty Ross to Harriet Tubman. And we believe she took the name Harriet in honor of her mother, because her mother's name was Rit.
Oh, that's lovely. A lot of questions very specific about the Underground Railroad. Did Harriet Tubman lead people through Howard County, Maryland? And what is known about Tubman's network in southern New Jersey and the eastern side of the Delaware River?
So we don't have documentation of her leading people through Howard County, unless she went on a train through Howard County. So we can't really document that easily. It's imaginable, but we haven't been able to document that. And in New Jersey, we know that she was there in 1852 and executed a mission from there. She left Cape May, New Jersey. She worked in the hotels during the summertime there to earn money, because her rescue missions were very expensive. They cost between $30 and $100 for each mission. So we know that she left in the fall of 1852 from Cape May to go to the Eastern Shore to rescue someone. But we don't know if she used any other places along that eastern side of New Jersey as part of her underground network. It's possible, but we just don't have the documentation for it yet.
Here is a question that Afua and I are very used to from the spy content. Did she use her womanly wiles to achieve her results?
Well, I don't know what that means. All I know is she used her great brilliance and genius and those lessons that she learned on that land, that the classrooms on that landscape, and those people that helped raise her and taught her to read that night sky, how to travel sort of quietly on a landscape so you can't be heard or seen. So that's she used her great mind for that.
Yes, we call this the Mata Hari effect around the Spy Museum, where every woman who spies must have used womanly wiles. So you answered that exactly the way I was hoping you would. Interesting question. Did Harriet Tubman collaborate with Sojourner Truth?
So they didn't collaborate per se. She actually met Sojourner Truth once in Boston, and Sojourner Truth encouraged Tubman to meet Abraham Lincoln, but Tubman never did. She was angry with Lincoln because he would not set all enslaved people free initially, and also he was slow to authorize the formation of Black regiments. So she was angry with him. Later in her life, she said she regretted not making the effort to meet Lincoln because, she felt he did the right thing. But she only met Sojourner Truth once. They both wanted the vote, though. They both were ardent suffragists, and they both wanted the vote. They deserved the vote, and tragically, both did not live long enough to achieve the vote.
I should have asked this question earlier. I'm trying to be chronological, but was she worried ever that her enslaver would track her down?
Harriet Tubman was afraid every single day that she might be captured. And as a matter of fact, I remember when I first started this work 20 some odd years ago, and I was working with a relative, a Tubman relative, and she said, I just have to tell you, Harriet Tubman lived with fear every single day, but she used that fear to protect herself. And I think you just don't have to add on to that. That's basically the truth. If you have fear, you're going to be careful. Yeah.
You mentioned her place in New York was purchased from William Seward. Did he help with the Underground Railroad at all? Someone wants to know.
So in his home in New York, they did shelter freedom seekers periodically. The William Seward House Museum has an archive, and they do have letters that Seward and other members of his family talk about sheltering freedom seekers there in their home in Auburn before the Civil War.
I think this will be my last question. Are there known descendants of Harriet, and are they at all involved with, or were they involved with the Civil Rights Movement or any movements today?
There are descendants today that have been identified that are descended from her brothers. Three of her brothers escaped and settled in the North. A fourth brother escaped, but he died. And then her sisters were sold away. We don't know what happened to them. And then the other sister, the fourth sister, died before she could be rescued. So the relatives, the descendants of her brothers in the North, some of them, yes, participated in civil rights movement. They may have been leaders in local activities. I don't know their histories that much, but they definitely were involved in civil rights and suffrage. Some of them were involved in the suffrage movement to get the vote. Even though their aunt Harriet Tubman couldn't vote, they were sure to get the vote.
Well, Afua, I know I said it was last question. I was going to turn it over to you, but we have such a great one before I disappear. Someone wants to know, how do we push to get her image on the $20 bill? Do you have any insights, Kate?
I do. Okay, so the design is basically done and it's slated for 2030, but we need to be sure that it won't be interrupted again because it's already been interrupted once. So call your Congress people and senators and make sure that it's secure. So when it comes out in 2030, it will happen. And it's going to be, the reason the delay is they're putting all the new features in it so that it won't be counterfeited, and people who are visually disabled will be able to tell what the note is because it's going to have special texture things to it. So there's a lot of work that has to go into creating it and then adjusting all those ATM machines that have to spit out the things. But make sure that it happens. So call them, please.
Wonderful. I make plans to definitely call. Thank you so much, Kate, for this enlightening discussion. March is Women's History Month, and I thought this couldn't have been a more fitting tribute. So thank you for a wonderful program. I also want to invite all of you to come to our upcoming programs. Next week, we have Spy Chat with Chris Costa and Fiona Hill on Monday, March 28th. I'm sure we'll be talking a lot about Ukraine and Russia. And please check out our website at spymuseum.org to sign up for this and other programs. And last but not least, we really do appreciate your support. So if you've enjoyed this program or watched our programs live or on YouTube, please do consider contributing to the Spy Museum. You can find all of that information on our website. I want to thank everyone for attending today and joining us and celebrating HT. And thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.